In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers and listeners and readers and all of you people who are out there in podcast land. This is the Sublation Magazine show. I'm Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley.
If you enjoy, Sublation, what you ought to do is click all the buttons. That is the like and the subscribe and the Patreon button, your belly button, the buttons that have replaced your eyes. And it is April 24th, 2023. We are going to be talking about the prospect for nuclear Armageddon, the proxy war in Ukraine, capitalism and how its contradictions have given rise to this moment. I will, of course, along the way, rant about the security state and the control of information that we're experiencing. But before we get into all that, Ashley, what do you have to say this morning? Or I guess where you are, it's this afternoon or evening?
It's this afternoon. It is past the coffee hour. It's on to the wine time. So I have been exploring crisis theory for the past 3 weeks. And I have always wanted to write something about how capitalism needs war. So we did the Grundrisse workshop on Saturday, which was really good. I really enjoyed that. And there's a bit in the Grundrisse where Mark says war is like capitalists dropping a third of their capital into the ocean, or governments or countries. I can't remember exactly. But the wonderful thing about the Grundrisse is that it's Marx's notebooks. And so he says all these wonderful things, and then he says nothing else. And so there are a lot of very interesting, there's a lot of stuff in obviously Capital Volume 3, but I've always wanted to sort of really delve into this idea of why capitalism, beyond sort of different ideas of imperialism and so on, really get down to the economics of it. And I am not an economist. I am interested in the economics of society, obviously. So what I did was I asked our good friend, Ted Reese, to write us an article for Sublation Magazine. And he turned in this brilliant 8,000 word piece. And so what we did is we turned that into a pamphlet. There it is.
Here are the pamphlets that have come out so far. We've done 3. The 4th one is coming soon on transgender politics. Then after that, it will be Ted Reese, and who knows what will come after that. If you wanted to get these, you can by going to Patreon and signing up at the pamphlet level. We do mail them out to you. Sometimes it takes a little longer than we'd like, but look, it's an ad. It's an ad. Okay.
And they make great children's toys because my kids play with them. They're pretending to read and stuff. Mm-hmm. Anyways. So I've also, who have I spoken to? I deep dived into neo-feudalism. I've got Joel Kotkin coming up. I want to really just flesh out this idea from the left to the right. And so we talked to Jody Dean. And so I'm really excited to talk to Ted. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and send him the link now, which I forgot to do. Oh, okay. And we're going to go into this. But Doug, do you think that capitalism causes war? That it is? Yeah.
Yes, I do. I think that the uneven development and the competition between nation states leads to war. I think that if we were to trace back the ultimate causes of the conflict between Russia and the United States, whether it would be in Ukraine or elsewhere, it can be traced back to the consequences of the economic decisions which were made in the neoliberal era, which is coming to a close, which created conditions where competition and rivalry and conflict were inevitable. That just from my way of thinking, the way that the United States and the rest of the Western world approached Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, set up this conflict as Russia couldn't, get its production going and compete and anything like on an even playing field in the world market, and its people were pushed into absolute despair and poverty, and in order to, raise itself up by its bootstraps, authoritarian measures were taken, and I mean, this is just a very simple-minded approach, but the conflict between the West and the East is really foundationally an economic conflict, and it could just as easily be between aspects of Europe or between Russia and China. The capitalists compete, and capitalist nations, imperial nations compete, and the people are the ones who suffer.
And we're all being asked to take sides in what amazingly has been presented as a fundamentally moral conflict. I remember right at the very beginning of the conflict with Ukraine, people were, those in power were saying, this is a war for democracy. And I just thought, really? Is that what we're doing? You people don't believe in democracy. You just like, what was it at that point? 6 years trying to overturn a referendum. You were throwing a hissy fit over free speech, over Donald Trump's democratic, oh my God, what's wrong with me today? I can't speak. Election, Jesus Christ.
Right. Yeah, there we go. There's the word.
Yeah, completely lost. I've got a weird sort of camera set up here, so I'm like, I see my face here, but I see you here, and it's really throwing me. Anyways, Donald Trump's election was giving everybody like Trump derangement syndrome. Nobody gave a shit about democracy, and all of a sudden it was like, this is a war for democracy. And I was like, this is pretty amazing to me. I mean, and then I went on GB News at the time, and I was saying, and I wrote an article in Compact about this, and I was like, this is the whole discourse around this is just so laughably stupid, so childish. Like, oh, Putin's megalomaniac. And it's like every single leader who we're supposed to hate, they call them megalomaniacs. That's like the word. They're like a journalist. They're like, oh, here we go. Or it's like the FBI. They're like, oh, here are your talking points. There you go, megalomaniac. Anyways, and oh, he's on steroids, and this madman is at the nuclear button. And I was like, it's about liquefied natural gas, among other things. It's never obviously just about oil and all of that. But obviously there's a deep underlying economic incentive, because war is risky and costly, and capitalists wouldn't do it if they didn't have to. And in fact, for a very long time, it appeared as though there would be other solutions to conflicts and crises and so on, because of the enormous risks involved. First of all, not just risks in the sense of like blowing up the world, which is obviously an important one, but the risks in terms of radicalizing people, because the 1930s radicalized people, and you almost had socialist revolutions in the heart of Europe. And this has scared the ruling class. So the push factors are so powerful.
So do we want to bring Ted in at this point to tell us about his pamphlet, which is coming soon from Sublation Media?
Yeah, so let's get Ted in here to stand up to rigorous critique of the people. Hi, Ted. Thank you so much for joining us. For those who don't know, Ted Reese is one of our authors, formerly from Zero Books Days, who wrote us an excellent book on Henrik Grossman, a fellow huge fan of Henrik Grossman. And by the way, if you join the Patreon, you'll get a lecture that I have recently given on boom and bust. Very, very intro, but I also talk a little bit about Henrik Grossman in that lecture. But Ted's written us this wonderful pamphlet, which is titled How to Stop World War III. And I think here's the issue, though. Part of the reason why we are finding ourselves thrown into World War III is that as a socialist movement, we have not been able to stop anything. We have not been able to stop this ever terrifying force of capitalist destruction. So can we really stop World War III?
Can we?
Well,
Ted?
that's a big question, and I don't claim to have all the answers, but the argument of the pamphlet is that, I'm not going to say the starting point, but a starting point is to be able to prove theoretically that war is a symptom of capitalism and its contradictions and its tendency towards decay. And without that, I think you have a harder job of proving that we need socialism to overcome the push for war and the manifestation of war.
Mm-hmm. You start by in your pamphlet, you start by claiming that we need to stop World War III, but then the second section is titled Neoliberalism and Decay. How do you think of neoliberalism, and how did it start to decay, or how is it decaying? What are the symptoms of its decay?
So I characterize neoliberalism as that is put in hyphenated, marks, neoliberalism, but I characterize neoliberalism in decay as the same way I would characterize Keynesianism in decay, which I've written on Sublation before about Keynesianism being a bridge to neoliberalism, and effectively the same capitalist tendencies emerge throughout both periods. So both periods represent certain phases of capital accumulation and the needs of capital accumulation at a certain point in time. And again, with neoliberalism, which was the same problem ultimately that Keynesianism faced, is it's a manifestation of capitalism in decay, where you get this tendency towards an overaccumulation of capital, which is a surplus of capital that cannot be reinvested profitably because the organic composition of capital is rising. So the outlay on capital is rising relative to the outlay on wages, in essence. And so the amount of capital that needs to be reproduced is growing ever steeper. So it's like, try and visualize yourself going up an ever steeper hill climb. Mm-hmm. It's getting more difficult. It's just law of diminishing returns, essentially, on capital accumulation. And so, neoliberalism is, a lot of people are arguing that we're in some sort of post-neoliberal phase already. And that's, quite a legitimate argument. But, ultimately we're talking about capitalism. And that's the point I'm ultimately making, is that it's not just neoliberalism. It's, neoliberalism was a symptom of capitalism's decay at a point in time that started around the 70s or manifested around the 70s. And that neoliberalism in decay has been, the overriding trend of the last 20 years, again, as a symptom of capitalism in decline.
One of the things you say in your pamphlet is that the United States debt is never going to be overcome either by innovating or by exploiting more labor. Like that it's going to be something like $19 trillion worth of debt sometime soon. And I don't remember the number of years that I think you said 32,000 years.
32,000 years
to overcome $1 trillion worth of debt if we paid it off at $1 per second. So we could cut that in half, to $2 a second.
Maybe that's a figure quoted from CNBC or something. But the point is that this debt is so high that it can't be inflated away and it can't be worked off by the public. It's just too big, so it has to be destroyed, and that's where war becomes more likely as one of the manifestations of capitalism in decline, and one of the counter tendencies that capitalism produces to try and offset its crisis. So war is, like Ashley was saying, it's a problem for capitalism because it has a radicalizing impact on the masses and on, you know, soldiers who might be left in the wilderness as logistics break down and resources are exhausted, as a final sort of representing phase of a last dying embers of capitalism in breakdown sort of thing. But yeah, so the debt is already over 30 trillion in the US, and it's already, as a percentage of GDP, at its highest ever, higher than at the end of World War II already. So that tells us that the relative overaccumulation is at its highest ever.
Can I just ask? So you said that the debt needs to be destroyed. At least what do you mean by that? Sort of physically destroyed, or you drop a bomb on all the landlords and then what do you mean? Can you explain for those who don't have a background in this?
Well, yeah, physically, but like at the theoretical level, it's capital value that needs to be destroyed. Like one of the, like probably the main counter tendency to the overaccumulation of capital is devaluation, but that's so devaluation.
Overaccumulation of capital is capital that can't be reinvested profitably. Just making sure.
Yeah. So it's a portion of existing capital that's not productive and is becoming sort of dead weight, and can't be reinvested profitably. So one example of it being destroyed is just to leave it, you know, pack up and go somewhere else where you can find a higher rate of exploitation and a higher rate of profit. So with outsourcing, for example, so the car factories in Detroit that have been left derelict, that is an example of capital and capital value that is stored or was stored within that physical capital that has been devalued through destruction, but it was a different type of destruction in that we just left it derelict, and you know it went devalued, and the production process was moved to a different part of the world where it was cheaper to produce. So that was a process of devaluation that helped to increase returns on capital investment.
Can I throw a comment up on the screen actually? And
yeah.
Go. All right. Someone says there was war before there was capitalism, right? And I just want to point out that the question that we're really asking is, why is there still war under capitalism? It's not that we're saying, oh, there wouldn't be wars if we were living under feudalism but rather the promise of modernity and capitalism both is that it brings the world together through a market where things are traded equitably. It brings the humanity together on big collective projects of production. It flattens out differences between peoples and nations, and yet these nations hold on, and conflicts continue, and war continues despite all the promise that is held in modernity. So I just want to point that out. The question is not how does capitalism cause why does capitalism cause war, but how can it be that we haven't overcome war as a feature of the human condition? I think.
No, Doug, I want to geek out on the economics here.
Sorry.
I'm sure we can do both.
Yeah, I just wanted to address that. Like, the way to think about all these economic questions is not as if they answer why do human beings go to war, but more to the point, what are the contradictions in our current society that hold us back from overcoming war and being free?
So I've never argued anything else that contradicts the idea that war has always been present throughout the history of private property. There are some recent scientific papers that argue that war didn't really exist before private property around 13,000 years ago, not on a substantial level that you could really characterize as war anyway. But, and wars have tended to increase when during the periods of modes of production collapsing, so slavery and feudalism, towards the end of feudalism, wars often led to feudal lords becoming bankrupt, and they would then be forced to sell their land to peasants. That was one of the ways that feudalism ended. So, and I've argued that something similar could happen towards the end of capitalism, where capitalists are left in a position where they need to start selling their property I would argue to a socialist state. I think that's going to be something that manifests. So you want to know why capitalism needs war. So the point is, so we've got a chronic slowdown in capital accumulation, and at the same time we have a growing population worldwide. That includes a growing population of capitalists. So you have, like, in absolute terms, relatively, the pool of capitalists is shrinking, but absolutely there's a growing number of capitalists, or there tends to be. Yet the rate of accumulation and the returns on profitable investment are slowing down. That's a decades-long manifestation. So you essentially have a shrinking pie and more people trying to get a slice of it. So that increases the competition between the factions of the ruling class and different capitalists, and that competition can manifest in war, and that can manifest in war between nation states, because wars require vast resources and levels of organization, and only a nation state can carry out that level of organization. So that's when we tend to see, in these periods where the level of overaccumulation is so high, which again was the case before World War I and World War II, we see these global conflicts starting to rear their heads, which start with intensifying trade wars and the geopolitical ramifications, and leading, towards an increasing likelihood of war between imperialist countries, because ultimately they are the ones with the biggest overaccumulations of capital.
I want to kind of address some of the comments here. So someone has said feudalism was not ended by war, but I don't think that was the argument that we made, but rather the Black Death. Because the Black Death made labor scarce and therefore more valued. And then someone says feudalism was already in crisis, but someone respond, feudalism was already in crisis by the time the plague hit. Remember, the 100 Years' War was like a decade in 1348. That's the thing, is like, there have always been like external shocks, right? The difference between, there were crises that almost ended the Roman Empire prematurely, that were caused by like volcanic eruptions and probably smallpox somewhere. But the difference is, within capitalism, these things are endemic to the system. But also, capitalism was already slowly developing within feudalism. And you could trace it to people have traced it to things like small changes in agriculture in the 8th century that then grow and become widespread in the 11th century. The crop rotation systems, this sort of thing, started to change. And you had all sorts of, I explained this in the lecture, by the way, that's on Patreon. But you had all of these rebellions and revolts that started to come up. And ironically, the peasants were trying to maintain the status quo, and the feudal lords were trying to go back to the way things were before the current status quo. So one of the sort of passwords that the peasants used with each other was to whom do you something like, to whom do you answer? And the answer was like, Richard, the boy king. Their allegiance was to the king. It's not like they were like they were very much trying to just hold on to the status quo, whereas the feudal lords wanted to go back, roll back even the small little things that they had given. And so there's, it's quite complex. It wasn't a war that ended these things. There was all these disruptions and upheavals, things that were going, that there was gold shortages, silver shortages, but gradually we got to this situation through like blood and guts and fighting and so on over a long period of time. And yeah, I mean, things like the Black Death played into this, but there are very few monocausal explanations for anything as large as an entire change in an economic and social system, which is why your pamphlet is so clear, but also very multifaceted and complex and goes across many different things. So anyway, I didn't want to sort of derail the conversation, but I just saw the people were responding. And then another question was your metric there, that it's going to take 32,000 years that you took from CNBC, says 636 years to reduce $30 trillion to $1 at 5% inflation, 45 years at 100% inflation, 17 years at 500% inflation. What do you have to say to that?
Nadia, you need to calculate that in dollars per second. Okay, that's how it's calculated.
But you do respond to that. You say that they can't inflate their way out of the debt.
Yeah, I think it would be a combination of some inflation, but also a massive amount of destruction, and that's part of what we're already seeing. Like when you see a spike in bankruptcies, that's part of what's happening. And inflation is actually symptomatic of bankruptcies to some extent, because when you get bankruptcies, you get supply chain problems and you get a rise in demand relative to supply. So that's part of the problem with why we've seen this manifestation of inflation.
Well, I want to address, I'm not sure if I'm really addressing this comment. Someone, Theory Shots asked, is there a monocausal explanation for the Russian Revolution? And I'm not exactly sure why that comment's arising, but here's what I think is in the background of all this talk of what caused the collapse of feudalism and what's causing war now in terms of capitalism, is this notion that everything it can be said to be determined by some set of material relations or social relations, right? And when we talk about how capitalism sets up the kinds of crises that lead to war, it's easy for, I think, people to feel utterly defeated, because in this moment, there is no alternative to capitalism. In this moment, not that there couldn't ever be one, but there isn't one now. It's not as though you can go to the voting booth and vote against capitalism or start a kind of institution that would work outside of the framework of capitalism, or even start a political party that wouldn't be influenced or framed by capitalist relations. So when we point to the political economy setting up a global conflict, it doesn't give workers or individuals much of an option politically to respond, unless we try to think through what it would take politically to respond. So, Ted, what do you make of the problem of politics today for a left that's been pretty decimated in the last decade? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry,
that's
the big question, and it takes, ultimately the end. I just argue for that it's going to take a new communist movement to end to either prevent or end a world war, whether it's World War III or World War IV. Because, as I say, if we don't prevent or stop World War III, and we end up on the other side of it and we've still got capitalism, then there will be a World War IV as well, because for the same reasons. Obviously, I don't know when, but for the same reasons that a World War III would emerge. And just laughing at the comment.
Yeah, comment says communist recommends communism.
I'm
Shocker.
I'm sorry to be so deadpan. That is my way. Yeah, it has to be building a movement of resistance to a world war, which is what the Bolsheviks tried to do. And obviously they didn't stop World War One, but they did end it. And maybe they ended it earlier than anyone else would have been able to. I'm sure if the Bolsheviks hadn't existed, World War One would have ended, but it probably would have taken longer, and it would have, it would have been a capitalist resolution to the end of that war, which wouldn't have been as favourable to the mass of the, regardless of what you think of the Bolshevik Revolution, it wouldn't have been, one way or another, it wouldn't have been as favourable to the bulk of the population at the time. And that's ultimately my argument. And as I say, a starting point for convincing people to move to the left, to move towards communist politics, is to understand why war is a manifestation of capitalism. Because ultimately, for everything that divides us, I'm sure the thing that unites us most is the desire to prevent a world war.
Well, you would think so, but that's the other thing that I'm surprised by today, which is that a great deal of even the Marxist left in America, so-called Marxist left, and certainly a great deal of the left from, let's say, Bernie Sanders to the left, is at the most ambivalent about opposing the continuation of the war, the proxy war right now in Ukraine. And it has primarily been the right in America, and I think perhaps globally, that has stood up to try to argue for some sort of peaceful negotiation. Someone says, we do have a candidate who just announced in the United States that's running for president, Robert Kennedy Jr. And Shawnee says, we're screwed. Robert Kennedy was saying truths about Ukraine, but he had to say it on Tucker Carlson. She says, I predict a right-wing fascist outcome. I think that, I don't know about fascism, but certainly it would be the right or the Republicans in the United States who are more likely to be advocating for peace. And I don't think that there's much of a chance that the right will be able to accomplish that, or the Republicans will be able to accomplish that. Then again, the left hasn't had a good track record on accomplishing the stopping or even slowing down a war since perhaps Vietnam. And it's unclear to me to what extent the peace movement, even then, was ultimately responsible, although there are people who would say that it was, and there's some evidence that it was. But what do we do? I mean, pointing to the fact that this is coming out of an economic crisis, and this has to do with the way capitalism functions, might help persuade some on the left to oppose the war. But have you found this has political traction? Are you convincing people who weren't convinced before to oppose the war?
I mean, like you say, sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not, it's, I think this is one of these other laws of life where volume seems to be important, because you can't convince everyone, but if you can increase the volume of people you're exposing your arguments to, you're likely to have a better outcome in absolute terms, which is the important thing. And I think that's the problem. I think that's a big problem is, the libertarian right has greater resources and funding and all the rest of it. And that's probably why it sounds like they are the voice of peace at the moment. And there's probably various other reasons for that in terms of where capitalism is at the moment. In the post-war period, Labour was strong because, similar to the end of feudalism, the demand for labour power relative to the amount of labour was higher. So Labour was in a stronger position. That was also true at the end of the Second World War, when we had, which gave, put social democracy in a strong position, even where socialist revolutions didn't succeed. And maybe that's sort of a factor in why Labour isn't strong at the moment. Because I try to look for material and historical explanations rather than just going, well, the left isn't doing what it should be doing. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be criticising the left or anything, but there are other factors at play in terms of why we're not stronger numerically and things like that, which are worth considering at the very least. But yeah, I think, like you say, I mean, I don't know about the libertarian right sort of winning in America. It might depend on the outcome of the war. That sort of thing is going to be important.
I don't think the war will be over by the time the next presidential election rolls around. Do you think that it could be ending soon?
I don't know.
I tend to be skeptical about claims that the reason the left isn't visible or more successful is primarily because we don't have the same amount of backing from capital as the right. I mean, I think that, it's one of those situations where, to the degree that we do have the same amount of backing as the right, is the degree to which we are unable to be independent from the Democratic Party and capital, and therefore would be unlikely to be able to mount much of a real anti-war effort that could gain traction in the working class, that would organize the working class as a political force. But right now, I'm just noticing that I am pretty sure that if Trump was still in office and this is going on, the left in America would be marching by the perhaps millions against.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah,
the conflict in Ukraine, and because he is in office, and it looks like a fight. The way it's cast is it's a fight between the Democrats and the Republicans. That's how it works out in the public imagination.
Yeah,
Biden is a Democrat and Putin is a Republican, the Trumpist, and so the left in America has a hard time backing the Trumpist or even calling for peaceful negotiation with the Trumpist. So.
One of the questions that I just put up on the screen was someone mentioned 1984, isn't it the case in 1984 there were permanent and semi-permanent war zones? And that was a question that I wanted to ask was, we talked to Fabio Vighi a couple of times, and one of the things that he said is that there's like this slow demolition, this sort of controlled demolition that's happening. And actually one of the questions I asked our Discord, what would you like to ask Ted Reese? And someone said, well, look, I understand the argument, but surely the capitalists themselves don't know and are not conscious of the fact. They don't know that they have to devalue, they aren't aware of what they're doing. So it seems to me that there's this almost semi-conscious attempt to kind of slow and draw out a crisis. Draw, instead of having like this crisis situation where it's like 2008 where all of a sudden everything was crashing and everybody's kind of panicking and you had these bailouts and it was all in the news. It was like, oh, we've got the coronavirus, and because of the corona, I'm not saying it's not real, it was real, I mean, obviously, but because of this crisis, now you have to bail us out, right? And you're kind of forced to, and so that nobody called any of that a bailout, and so you have all of these things happening just slowly. Is it possible that we could have these sort of forever wars instead of there being like this great big world conflict that just explodes? And maybe it's the last one, as they say, that famous Einstein quote, if there's ever a World War III. I can't remember what the line was, but you get what I'm saying. Instead of this like culmination, could it be a long, drawn out attempt to restore profitability instead of a huge bang, a crisis or a war, a world war?
Yeah. I mean, you can't rule that out at all. I don't make any particular predictions about how it could manifest, because that's harder to predict. What I'm describing is the underlying tendencies and the reasons for them. I'm not claiming to know everything about everything, or politically, and how and where wars are going to arise and why in on the ground. But if you have a like war can manifest in certain geographical areas, because those are where the resources are. That's where the cheaper labor is. That's where the natural resources that need to be mined are. Those are absolutely factors in why wars are fought where they are. The war in Ukraine is partly being fought because the US and the UK want to privatize the remaining state assets in the UK, which means they're fighting for labor. They're fighting to control labor that they didn't previously control, so that they can exploit that labor. So, and I dare say that Russia is doing the same thing. So these are the sort of factors that you have to consider. But yeah, it could be drawn out in, and I'm sure, and like you said earlier before I came in, like the warmongers do tend to delay the onset of war until they're left with no other option, which really shows that it's the sort of the economic impetus that really pushes them in this direction.
Well, people in the chat are saying that we're demoralizing them, and I think that may be my fault.
They're all like black pilled. Everybody.
I just want to throw another black pill out on the table, which is I watched the movie 1984 last night, and
as you do, good night. In the evening, I like to wind down with 1984.
Yeah, I wound down my day with watching 1984 with my son Noah, and
I'm going to dream about it tonight now.
I dreamt about it. Actually, two things happened during watching the movie. One is about halfway through, or maybe a little less than halfway through, he says, "You know what? I think I'm on Big Brother's side." Yeah, pissed me off. And then at the end, he says he was watching Winston, chanting, "Up with Big Brother, up with Big Brother," because he's been completely hollowed out and turned into a good citizen and no longer capable of love. And my son says, "That reminds me, it's the same as the ending of Christmas Carol, where Ebenezer Scrooge runs outside and says, 'Merry Christmas, everyone.'" So those are the Zoomer snarky responses to the current moment, or at least to that movie. But I do have to say that in this, I know that it's kind of become a joke or a trope or a meme or something to compare everything to 1984. But it is true that in 1984, there's perpetual war as a way to manage the population, as well as, I think, what is unsaid, to manage the economy. That's not in 1984, but and I think in U.S. history, it's pretty clear that we've had perpetual war. We just got out of Afghanistan, and now this is happening in Ukraine, right? I mean, so does to what extent, I guess, and maybe you don't have an answer to this, maybe we can just speculate about this, but to what extent does the need to manage the economy go hand in hand with the need to manage the population? That, how can we think about the limitations that are being put on our own freedom right now, in terms of being able to speak freely on the internet, as an example, without state intervention, go hand in hand with the need for the states to try to put their hands into the market and devalue capital here and grab labor over there, to does the state need to be more to intervene more and more as the economy gets out of whack?
I mean,
and are you for or against Big Brother? That's my final question.
Oh, I couldn't answer that.
Not on this stream.
You know, I think that's that's obviously a political necessity arising out of a wartime situation. You do not want resistance to the political regime, so you have to try and find ways of managing the population. And so, I mean, we see it time and time again with war. You usually start out with most of the population being against the war, and then the bourgeois media turns the screw and manages to, over a period of months, turn popular opinion the other way. Whether it does that, by manipulating us through the messages that it sends out, and by manipulating polls, I don't know, but you would think it would be silly not to if you were them. So yeah, and the other thing is, you can certainly during World War One, they would offer, they would make offers to certain layers of the population to get them on side. So they would find ways of raising the number of people employed, and that would help. That would help them, maybe by spreading out working hours, for example, or and at the same time reducing working hours. Maybe they would temporarily improve welfare to some degree for some part of the population. So yeah, things like that can keep enough people on side for long enough to be able to prolong a wartime effort.
You are a scholar of Grossman and Heinrich Grossman, and I'm interested to know what he specifically said about, like, first of all, when did he die? What was the period of time that he was writing about, and what was his understanding of how crisis and war intertwined?
He died in 1954, I think, in East Germany. He moved to East Germany after World War II. He, his health suffered throughout the war, and he had a stroke. And he was teaching economics in East Germany, but his health deteriorated in that period before he died. I think he gave us the clearest theoretical basis to understanding war under capitalism and as a manifestation of capitalist breakdown. So, like I said, overaccumulation tends to rise with each crisis. That tends to intensify, sharpen the competition between capitalists, and therefore the likelihood of war manifesting rises. He also argues that the number of countries becoming imperialist tends to rise because a larger number of countries approach the state of overaccumulation. So obviously there's a lot of debate about whether Russia is imperialist, whether China's imperialist, even, Israel and India. I don't have the answers to that specific question. You need to look at how much capital they're exporting and how frequently, and that sort of thing. But certainly there's more countries approaching a state of overaccumulation in their own right, because any capitalist ruling class in any nation will come up against the limits of their own population in terms of the size of the labor base that they're exploiting. And that's when you get this impulse of, or that's part of why you get this impulse to export capital. And so the competition on the world market limits the amount of, limits your ability to to offset this overaccumulation, because there's multiple nation states and corporations and empires fighting over the same territory. But he also shows why capitalism can benefit war in terms of, accelerating devaluation through the destruction of physical capital, which contains capital value, which is therefore devalued.
Do you think the people in charge are aware of the need for devaluation? And is there a conscious effort being made amongst the capitalists in the world to devalue capital and to, do they think of the wars that are going on as a part of a project to do that? And also, finally, do you think a nuclear war, maybe small scale tactical nukes, would do a good job of bringing down the capital?
So I think they're conscious. I don't think they're like as conscious as Henrik Grossman, so to speak, in terms of like the accuracy of or precision of their understanding, perhaps. But they certainly know that they want to devalue labor power, right? And they're actively pursuing that goal.
Yeah, well, if you kill off a lot of laborers, that won't devalue labor time.
Well,
right?
well, yeah. As I say in the pamphlet, it swings back the other way. But at one point in time, they need to devalue labor power, and war can be a good way of doing that if you have a particular need to devalue it quickly and on a relatively
and
large
it's devalued
basis.
Because you're limiting the power of labor to produce commodities at a certain rate. Like you're destroying the physical, infrastructure for production, and therefore the labor becomes cheaper, and you would actually hire more laborers because you're not going to put them behind a machine that you just press a button to pop out a commodity, but go back to a different kind of production. Or how is labor exactly devalued in this process?
Well, if you look at Ukraine,
it was the opposite, right? Because you're killing a whole bunch of people, so aren't there fewer people? Sorry.
Yeah, I just said that.
Oh, did you? Oh,
Yeah,
I was looking at the comments. I'm sorry.
Eventually it manifests, or it tends towards manifesting that. But at the start of a war, look at Ukraine. They've Zelensky has imposed loads of anti-labor legislation that forces the Ukrainian workers to work for a lower wage and to not be able to, to make it legal to fight against that. So that has devalued labor power in Ukraine. As the war goes on and the body count rises, that does start to swing back the other way. So it's dialectical. It's both. But yeah, if you can increase unemployment, that will, which a war can do, that will, depending on how it's dealt with, that will devalue labor power, because you get the unemployed weighs down on the employed labor, increases competition between laborers, and therefore reduces the bargaining power of the individual laborer.
Well, someone says that that all war does is justify the proletarian's cruelty towards itself, and that was in response to us talking about the increasing the value of labor. But when we're talking about increasing the value of labor, we don't mean individual human beings' value in some social sense or moral sense, but rather the cost of labor power, measured in terms of money or wages, not the actual value of a human life. So Dave L says, "Oh, you're going to Secret Asian Dan." Go ahead.
Sorry. So yeah, just the counter argument obviously is that the U.S. had nationalized childcare during World War II because that's how valuable war made labor.
Well, that cheapened labor power, because it cheapened the reproduction of labor power.
Yeah, it introduced a whole new population into the labor market, creating more potential laborers and therefore driving down wages.
And also women tend, at least at that time, were paid less. So you could bring a whole bunch of women into the market and drive down the cost of labor power of men. All sorts of things go on with that. It's not, childcare doesn't necessarily mean that things are going great for labor. In fact, it's usually the opposite. Like you can cut all sorts of other kinds of social spending and like force women into work and be like, see, and they're like, but I can't, I got children. And they're like, no, here we got childcare. So go work your shitty jobs.
Yeah, we've just done that in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Or to some extent anyway.
Someone said that women are still paid less. They're not. It depends. Like after you have children, yes, you are, because you work less. But anyways, so one of the things that comment that you brought up, where it was like, oh, the proles just want to kill each other and they just love the idea of their neighbor getting killed so that they get there fewer people.
Wait, did I bring that up? I think that
that was the next comment that was underneath the one that you brought up.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. I wondered, like, at the opening of your pamphlet, you quote someone from the Business Insider from 2010 saying, do we need another war to breathe new life and power into current or new international financial institutions, solving problems currently deemed intractable? Like, yeah. What kind of world, when you read something like that, what kind of world have we humans created, right? We're like, do we need to sacrifice 50 million people? I just wondered, like, should we just make a big, huge blood sacrifice because it seems like the monster is angry? You know, this is, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, maybe that is preferable. Maybe we want to be like the Aztecs and kind of like kill off a whole, because who gets killed off, right? Poor people, working class people. Maybe people have, maybe I'm playing devil's advocate here, obviously, but maybe that's what humanity has decided, that we are willing to make that sacrifice, that every 50 odd years, maybe 30, no, we've kicked the can down the road long enough. I don't know, every so many years, we just have to sacrifice 10 million, 20 million people to keep this thing going. Maybe that's like, instead of trying to realize that the gods aren't going to look favorably on you anyway, we've just decided that we'll continue on with the illusion, because letting go of the illusion is maybe even more dangerous.
Well, certainly that's an expression of the capitalist class, and that's what they try to convince the rest of us of. But it just shows the innate barbarism and, frankly, savagery of the capitalist system and the ruling class. That's all I can say, really.
Well, I want to say that for people who are talking about the bloodthirsty proletariat, I just want to point out that in the United States, and this is, I'm going to sound, I guess I'm really just going to be sounding like Chris Catrone, who pointed this out to me originally, and who writes about this in his book, The Death of the Millennial Left. But in the United States, Donald Trump ran as a peace candidate in 2016. He wasn't in terms of what he actually did in office, but he ran as a peace candidate. And the greatest amount of his support, the most consistent demographic to support Donald Trump, were military families who had not military families with officers in the military, but military families with rank and file soldiers in the military, because they were all exhausted by the endless wars, the one conflict after another. They'd lost people. Either directly as casualties or through injury or psychological harm and shell shock. And the families have been devastated by the wars, and they wanted to see their kids and the military stay home. Yeah. And Trump argued that that's what he would do, that he would change the nature of international politics. He would walk away from the bloodthirsty institutions like NATO.
Sake, why? Sorry.
I think that sums up the whole discussion.
I can't understand why my camera is doing this. Sorry.
Anyway, so that portion of the proletariat was not bloodthirsty, and in general, I don't think the population is bloodthirsty. But
No,
right.
no, not at all.
No.
The vast majority of people do not want war in any shape or form, let alone a world war with contemporary technology and nuclear capabilities. Not at all.
Yeah, and someone's asking, Doug, is a Trumper now? And the answer is no. I'm not a Trumper
Now,
or now either. Nor was I before. I have not. I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of the MAGA Republican Party. But I did want to point out that even right-wing candidates can be the product of exhaustion with war, and that you have to take in. You can't, like Trump was bellicose and violent in his rhetoric, but he also promised to slow down the imperial war machine as one of his major campaign promises, which he did not keep. But
no.
But nonetheless, that promise had particular resonance with military families who by and large are right wing or conservative. They're not usually part of the left, or haven't been for many years. But nonetheless, they are exhausted by war. That was my point. Not that Donald Trump is my Lord and Savior. Amen.
Yeah,
but you can clip that out and put that up over and over again.
We invite people to do this all the time. We're just like,
it's probably very difficult to be a military family and not be right wing, because you're being raised by the state, right? Mm-hmm. You're being raised by the capitalist state. You're being indoctrinated by the capitalist state. They're trying to train you to be in favor of war so that you're ready for war at any time. And despite that, you still get these military families becoming disillusioned with the whole thing and, desiring peace. And so nobody knows better than them. And this should be an opportunity for a dialogue with those families between us and them, frankly, to discuss what we're discussing now. I don't care that they're not on the left. I still want to talk to them.
Yeah, I agree. Listen, we've been going for just about an hour. Ashley, we're going to end the stream. Maybe you can figure out what's going on with your camera in between.
It's a very expensive camera. Like, why isn't it working?
And Ted, if you have time, you can stick around for the second half, because we're going to do that in the Parrot Room or the Patreon. Everybody look in the description. I'll post a link as a comment as well and pin the comment. Come support us on Patreon. Somebody said we were low energy this week. We can't be high energy every week, okay, folks? But we'll do our best, and you should come and support us if you can. And thanks for watching.
In the case of nuclear or